Neighbors, this is me again in my favorite spot, cuddled up to my old buddy heating stove here. Nothing like a wood stove. It kind of brings body and soul together, and a good time to reflect on years gone by. I guess probably everybody knows now that I was a trucker for the better part of 50 years or so, and so I might have a yarn or two to spin. But anyway, it all began back years ago when I started driving professionally. My first job with a tractor trailer was in 1953. Took a job with Merrill Transport out of Portland. It covered all of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Occasional trip to New Jersey. And before that, of course, I was raised on a large farm, dairy farm, so that's where you get a real education. But I wasn't much interested in formal education. All I wanted to do was get it over with and go to work, which it kind of brings to mind the old saying of be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. So anyway, I did go to work, and I stayed with Merrill Transport for almost 6 years, and that entailed some pretty hairy expeditions. It seems after a year or so, the company took a contract for delivering oil and gasoline to way up in northern Maine. The only way you could get back into the logging camps was to go to Jackman, to Armstrong, go back to St. George, take a right and follow the border. And there's a port of entry at St. Rose, St. Aurelie, Dacquam, and Lake Frontier with checkpoints, border crossing agents, and all of those logging roads that went way back into the woods. The major one, I guess, was at Clayton Lake. And I think everybody's probably heard of Clayton Lake. It was International Paper's headquarters for that whole area. And so I delivered even sometimes aviation gasoline for the planes that flew in and out of there, mainly U.S. mail. They actually had a post office there in Clayton Lake. And that was about 40 miles back in the woods, and so that was IP Depot. And so you can imagine that the roads they were plowed, of course, but they weren't salted or sanded because the loggers would rather run on packed snow or ice than to have to deal with soft spots and all of that. And so it was a matter of delivering heating oil and gasoline to the big logging camps, which some of those camps had 40 or 50 guys that lived right there all week long, and then they went back over. They were all Canadians. They went back over the border to their homes on the weekends. And so I remember some places, especially like going in from Lake Frontier, there was a couple of real steep grades in there. I had to stop before we got to the major part of the very steep inclines there and chain up. And that meant putting single chains on the outside doors on the trailer and triple side chains on the drive wheels and a single chain on the left front steering axle. The only way you could manage with this kind of vehicle to get anywhere. And I know one time I had left St. George, and right at the bottom of the hill, it seemed like all the little villages, small towns were built right on a hill. And a big stone church and a settlement of a dozen, maybe 15 homes. But right at the bottom of a very steep hill in St. Rose, the railroad tracks went through there. And so I was trying to get a run for this hill to get my momentum up, and the railroad had been through and taken all that ice off of the crossing. So that meant there was probably 6 or 8 inches of ice and snow had been removed, and so that meant that there was a deep hole there where they took that ice out. And I hit that with all the speed I could get, which probably at that point I might have been doing 40 miles an hour. But anyway, I didn't see that that depression was there until it was too late. And I hit it, and it broke the rear drive axle housing off right clean from the outside of the springs. And so that was it. I was shut down. Well, here I am, a few hundred miles from home. In those days, we didn't have cell phones, and there was very few pay phones available, but there happened to be a little repair garage there. And I found someone who could speak enough English for him to understand what my situation was. And these little small towns didn't have any hotels or motels or bed and breakfast, none of that. So anyway, this fella arranged for me to spend 2 nights with an older couple who lived in a little house there all by themselves, just snowed in for the winter and happy to be there. And I couldn't speak a word of French, and they couldn't speak a word of English. So you can imagine that there was 2 nights and 2 days in an atmosphere like this, but they were the finest kind of people. They tried to communicate, but it was impossible. But they understood that I was waiting for a tow truck or a wrecker to come from Portland. And the weather closed in, so they didn't get there until the second day of my sitting in the roadway there, broken down. So anyway, that went pretty darn good. They had a little tiny TV, but it only had a French-speaking half snowstorm TV there, but I watched a little bit and just hung out until they finally made it up there from Portland. They brought up a new tractor for me and took the broken down one back to Portland. And it got a little interesting at times because I was always in a hurry to make the border crossings because they had certain hours that they were open, and if you missed that, that meant you had to stay there until the next morning for the border patrol to come and open up. So anyway, it was like many a time you would meet some of the big loggers coming out of there, and they have as many as 4 trailers in a train. They call them a train. And they had their problems, and it was understood we had to give them the right of way because they could always pull my little truck back into the road, whereas imagine getting stuck in a ditch with a truck that size. It really was like it was like sharing the road with a freight train. So it became quite interesting at times, especially in the wintertime, which that's when all the wood products came out of those roads out to the railroad and on the Canadian side. And so there was some pretty interesting times there, like where the narrow one-lane bridge crossed the St. John River, and you go down a steep bank to get onto the bridge from either direction. So everybody would always stop and listen to make sure that no one was coming the other way because you couldn't pass another vehicle on the bridge. And I remember one time I got halfway across the bridge and one of the log haulers, it didn't stop and listen. So we were at loggerheads there. Someone had to back up, and he tried to back up fully loaded up the hill on his side, couldn't do it. And so I already had chains on. I was the one to back my tractor trailer back up the hill and over far enough to let him by. Another instance of going in from Lake Frontier was there was a big operation for logs and pulpwood back in there. The finest kind of Canadian gentleman that owned the camp back there. He knew that I would have trouble making some of the grades that went in there. And I would put chains on, but it was a matter of spin and jump and do all the things that trucks do when you're trying to make a steep grade with chains on. So he made arrangements to have a long cable that stayed beside the road. So as the loggers came out, if I was having trouble in the hill, they would stop and run that cable out, hook onto the front of my truck, and back up and pull me up those hills. And that got a little, to say the least, a little hairy. Sometimes I watch the show on TV, the Ice Road Truckers. Well, some of the experiences we had in there wasn't too much different. Only one time that a bridge broke underneath the weight of my truck, and I had to stay in a logging camp for 2.5 days while they rebuilt the bridge. I couldn't get back out. So they were a little upset about that. But anyway, it went on for, I think, 3 winters that I was on that detail. And I did notice that every once in a while I wasn't able to meet the demands for the oil they needed up there, and I would recruit another driver to go with the second truck to follow me up there and show them their way around up in the North Main woods. Very seldom I would find a driver that was willing to go the second time, so that'll tell you something. Once was enough, and I think after a while they gave it up because it was not a money-making proposition. But anyway, those are some of the things that I encountered on that part of my driving. And went from there to hauling locally over decent roads and stayed pretty much in civilization from there on. So we come back down from from there for the last time, said goodbye to everybody, and I got to know a lot of real fine people, and I did learn a little bit of French along the way. So being bilingual is not the worst thing that could happen, especially if you're going to go in somebody else's country. I wish we would see a little bit more of that, the way things are in our own country now. But anyway, that's a little story about one of the more hair-raising jobs that I had. And the good Lord looked after me sometimes is the only explanation of how I could make it. So that will kind of explain where it all began. Time goes by, I'll try to share with you some other things. Probably.
A kiss is still a kiss, but a sigh is just a sigh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Remember that song?
So anyway, we'll look forward to doing it again one of these times, and I can kind of relate to some of my experiences, and I'm sure that some of you guys that have been over the road know a little bit more about what I'm saying, okay? So in the meantime, this is Christmas Eve Day, 2013. I wish everybody a very Merry Christmas and the happiest of all New Years. So long.